friend, Ted Cruz.
Thank you very, very much. Kelly Ayotte is a rock star. Let me tell you, your senator is tough as granite. There is no stronger advocate of the men and women in our military in the U.S. Senate than is Kelly Ayotte. And there is no one tougher going to get the truth about what happened in Benghazi than Kelly Ayotte. Your senator is part of a new generation of leaders who are stepping forward. And let me say, on behalf of Texans and on behalf of Americans across our great nation, thank you to the state of New Hampshire for your tremendous Senator Kelly Ayotte. I also want to start by thanking Ambassador Petrone and Augusta for your tremendous hospitality, for opening up this incredible home, for bringing a Texan from the swamps of Houston to this exquisite vista that is truly breathtaking, and I'm pretty sure that you can actually see Canada from here. So I appreciate y'all going above and beyond to welcome me. And I'll note as I went upstairs in the home that Augusta had a bumper sticker sitting by the stairs that said, "Stop crime, shoot back." And that is really how you make a Texan feel at home. I want to thank Jennifer for your incredible hard work bringing this together, all of the bringing everyone here. And I want to thank all of y'all for traveling. So many of you traveled hours and from all over the place to be here. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Now, I do need to begin with just a warning. By virtue of your coming here tonight, tomorrow morning, each of you will be audited by the IRS. So thank you for the strength of the courage of your convictions. You know, this week, our eldest daughter, Caroline, started kindergarten. So it is a big week in the Cruz household. Caroline was giddy. She was jumping off, bouncing off the walls. And it made me think back to a couple of years ago. A couple of years ago, Heidi and I were on vacation with our two girls, and we were with some friends who also have two little girls. And we were going out to dinner, and Caroline wanted to drive with them, and there was no space in the car. Caroline was 3 at the time. And she proceeded to fall down to the ground and kick and yell and scream and throw a total tantrum. I know none of y'all have ever had kids do anything like that. And my wife, Heidi is tough. And so she had a very stern conversation with Caroline. And dinner was almost canceled, and then it wasn't. We went to dinner. We went back to the hotel room on vacation. We went up to the hotel room, and Heidi and I are kneeling down with Caroline as she's saying her prayers at night. And Caroline looks up, and she goes, "Dear Jesus, today, we had a situation. And I'm not sorry, but it's not going to happen again." Heidi and I just bit our tongues not to laugh out loud at that precious, precious prayer. And you know what? That's why each and every one of us is here today. We're here because of our kids. We're here because of our grandkids. We're here because we're worried about the direction this country's going. And we're here because we want to make sure our kids and grandkids have every bit of opportunity and even more that we were blessed to have. And so I want to come here today with just a word of hope and optimism. Something incredible's happening, I am convinced. We are seeing a new paradigm in politics that is changing the rules. And that new paradigm is the rise of the grassroots. There is no power in politics like the grassroots. And I want to talk about the grassroots in the past, in the present, and in the future. In the past, I want to give the example of my race for Senate in Texas. Now, when we launched the campaign, January of 2011, I was at 2% in the polls. The margin of error was 3%. Those were our real poll numbers. I'm not making that up. I was really, really excited with those numbers. Until Heidi pointed out to me that technically I could have been at negative 1%. We ended up going through a $50 million primary. It's the most expensive primary in the entire country. We were outspent 3-1. Had $35 million in nasty, personal, ugly attack ads. You know, midway through, Heidi's watching all those ads. She turns to me and says, "Goodness gracious, I didn't know you were such a rotten guy." And what we saw happen was incredible. We saw grassroots leaders throughout Texas. We saw Republican women like my friend Sylvia Manley. We saw Tea Party leaders. We saw business leaders. We saw community activists come together, men and women that began knocking on doors, began making phone calls, began sending emails and getting on Facebook and getting on Twitter and reaching out to everyone they knew and saying, listen, we can't keep doing what we've been doing. We got to turn things around. And despite being outspent 3-1, we went from 2% in the polls to not just winning, but winning the primary by 14 points and winning the general by 16 points. That was a testament to the grassroots. It was a testament to the power of men and women across the state with a passion to turn our country around. And I'll tell you, I don't think I have ever been a part of anything in my life that was more humbling and inspiring. I'll tell you a true story from the campaign trail. I was up in Lubbock, Texas during the runoff. And an older gentleman came up to me, someone I didn't know. And he put his hand on my shoulder. He said, "Ted, I'm 74 years old. I'm retired. I gave you $2,500 for the primary out of my retirement savings." And he said, "Tonight, I'm giving you another $2,500 for the runoff out of my retirement savings. Because if we don't stop what's happening in this country, my retirement's going away." Now look, that's powerful when you look in someone's eyes and they're saying, "Please help us turn things around." That's the power of the grassroots. Now let's talk about the present. You know, one of the very first fights that I was privileged to be a part of in the Senate was standing side by side with my friend Senator Rand Paul in his 13-hour filibuster on drones. Now, when that started, it was 11:47 a.m. that Rand Paul went down to the floor of the Senate. And most of our colleagues thought what he was doing was strange, curious, even quixotic. The first two senators to show up to support him were Mike Lee and myself. And what happened is the American people began to get engaged. All across this country, people became fixated by C-SPAN. A phrase that does not occur naturally in the English language. I say to our good friends at C-SPAN. And we saw people all over the country going online and tweeting and speaking out and saying, yes, defend our constitutional rights. And it was incredible as the day went on. One senator after another came to the floor of the Senate. A number had gone home to dinner, and their staffs called them and said, hey, get back here. And you'd see colleagues of mine come, they'd say, Twitter is blowing up. You'd see colleagues of mine coming to the floor of the Senate going, well, the Tweety thing is happening. I need to be here. For 13 hours, the American people spoke up and spoke loudly. And because of the involvement of the grassroots, the next day, President Obama was forced to do what he had refused to do for 3 consecutive weeks, which is admit in writing that the Constitution limits his authority to target U.S. citizens. That was a victory of the grassroots. That couldn't have been done from Washington. It could only have been done from the American people. You know, the next big fight we got involved in was the battle over guns. Now, we all remember the horrific, heart-wrenching tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut. And unfortunately, following that tragedy, President Obama didn't come out and say, let's go after violent criminals. Let's do everything we can to stop violent crime. Listen, I think violent criminals, we ought to come down on like a ton of bricks. But unfortunately, President Obama instead tried to use that tragedy as an excuse to go after the constitutional rights of law-abiding citizens. Vice President Joe Biden you know, you don't need a punchline. You just say his name, people laugh. But Vice President Joe Biden told all of us, said if anybody attacks your house, just go outside with a double-barreled shotgun and fire both barrels in the air, which is very, very good advice if it so happens you're being attacked by a flock of geese. But let me tell you, that fight over guns, in the early days and weeks, that fight looked unwinnable. The momentum was entirely with the president. All of the media told us it could not be won, and there were lots of senators on the edge wavering. A handful of senators stood up and said, we will filibuster any legislation that undermines the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. And what happened next was exactly the same thing that happened with drones. What happened next was the American people began getting involved, began speaking out, began emailing, began tweeting, began calling their senators and saying, defend our Bill of Rights. Let me tell you, one of the most effective defenders we had of the Second Amendment was your Senator Kelly Ayotte. And any New York mayor who thinks he can come up here and bully the senator from New Hampshire seems a little bit confused by the concept of live free or die. But as a result of the American people getting engaged, all of the senators that were on the fence, that were thinking about going with the president, that were agonizing, when it came the day for the vote, every single proposal of President Obama's that would have undermined the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms was voted down on the floor of the Senate. That's the power of the grassroots. That's the new paradigm that we're seeing. So let's talk about the future. In my view, the top priority for every Republican should be to champion growth and opportunity. You know, in the last 4 years, our economy has grown, on average, 0.9% a year. To put that in context, there's only one other period post-World War II of 4 consecutive years of less than 1% growth on average. 1979 to 1982, you're exactly right. Coming out of Jimmy Carter, and it was the same failed economic policies, out of control spending and taxes and regulation, and it produced the exact same economic stagnation. Now listen, I think restoring economic growth ought to be a bipartisan objective. It ought to be the top priority of every elected official, Republican or Democrat. Because, you know, growth is foundational to everything else. If you want to turn around unemployment, we got to have growth. If you want to turn around our unsustainable debt, you got to have growth. If you want to maintain the strongest military in the world to protect our national security, you have got to have growth. Now, how do you get growth? 3 simple steps. Number 1, finally reining in the out-of-control spending and unsustainable debt in Washington. You know, last fall, I had the privilege of speaking at the Republican convention down in Tampa. And I talked about the national debt. I talked about our 2 little girls, Caroline and Catherine. That evening, Heidi and I got back to the hotel rooms, about 1:30 in the morning. I pulled out my iPhone, began looking at Twitter. And it so happened that Paula Poundstone, the comedian, was watching the convention that night. I guess she didn't have anything better to do. And she sent a tweet. She said, Ted Cruz just said, when his daughter was born, the national debt was $10 trillion. Now it's $16 trillion. What the heck did she do? Which Heidi and I laughed so hard we almost fell out of bed. I said that at another gathering, and a guy in the back said, so it's her fault. But you know what? Caroline is 5. In her short life, our national debt has grown over 60%. Listen, what we are doing to our kids and grandkids is fundamentally immoral. It is wrong. If we don't turn back from this path, they're going to spend their whole adult lives not working to meet the challenges of the next generation, not working to meet the challenges of the future, but working to pay off the debts that we're racking up. Our parents didn't do that to us. Their parents didn't do that to them. You know, there are a lot of people in the media that say anyone who was elected with support from the Tea Party, those guys are radical, they're extreme. I have to admit, I just have to chuckle at that. It is only in Washington, D.C. that it is considered radical to want to live within your means. It is only at the United States Capitol that it is considered extreme not to want to bankrupt our kids and grandkids. The second step to restoring economic growth is fundamental tax reform. Our tax code is far too complicated. It's far too Byzantine. You know, there are more words in the IRS code than there are in the Bible. Not a one of them is as good. Every year we spend roughly $500 billion on tax compliance, on lawyers, on accountants. That's roughly the entire budget of our military. And it's pure deadweight loss, as we like to say in Texas. It doesn't produce a single truck or tortilla. And then we've seen the abuses from the IRS. We've seen the IRS targeting the political enemies of President Obama's. We've seen the IRS asking citizen groups, tell us what books you're reading. Prepare a book report on the books you're reading. We've seen them telling other citizens, tell us the content of your prayers. You know what? The federal government has no business asking any American the content of our prayers. Now, on one level, this scandal reflects the corruption and abuse of power of the Obama administration. But on another level, it is indicative of just too much power in Washington. When the federal government thinks it has that much power over our lives, it doesn't matter which party is in power, something is wrong. And that's why I think the simplest and best solution is we should abolish the IRS. We should move to a simple, fair, flat tax so every American can fill out his or her taxes on a postcard. Now, in Washington, D.C., that's what's known as crazy talk. Because listen, let's be very, very clear. Abolishing the IRS, that ain't going to be easy. And the reason is there is an army of lobbyists on K Street who make hundreds of millions of dollars getting exemptions to the tax code, and frankly, there are career politicians in both parties with a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. I don't know how many of y'all have run across management consultants, but they have a phrase called BHAGs, big, hairy, audacious goals. Abolishing the IRS is a big, hairy, audacious goal. But if I'm right that we're seeing a new paradigm, the rise of the grassroots, the ability of the American people to hold elected officials accountable, it is only through that new paradigm that we can get that done. The third piece to restoring economic growth is regulatory reform. President Obama has unleashed regulators like locusts on small businesses, destroying jobs. Only problem is you can't use insecticide on the regulators. Now that's tough. I'm like, they're in the back going, want to bet? And there is no more important regulatory reform we could do than to repeal every single word of ObamaCare. Now, we are right now in the middle of a fight. We have, I believe, the single best opportunity we have had to actually succeed in stopping Obamacare. On September 30th, 38 days from today, the continuing resolution that funds the federal government expires. I have publicly pledged, along with a number of other senators, that under no circumstances will I support a continuing resolution that funds even 1 penny of Obamacare. Now let me take a couple of minutes talking about this, in terms of why it's important and how we can win. There is bipartisan agreement right now that Obamacare isn't working. The lead author of Obamacare, Democrat Senator Max Baucus, has publicly described it as a huge train wreck. That's the guy who wrote it. Now maybe he didn't read it. The president of the Teamsters, James Hoffa, has publicly said Obamacare is destroying the 40-hour work week that is the backbone of the American middle class. Now that's not me saying that, that's the Teamsters. The IRS Employees Union has publicly asked to be exempted from Obamacare. These are the guys in charge of enforcing it on us. And most strikingly, President Obama has now unilaterally and lawlessly exempted members of Congress from Obamacare. Shameful. That's exactly right. It is shameful. You know, that happened after Harry Reid and the Senate Democrats sat down in a closed-door session meeting with him, where, according to public reports, they basically begged, let us out from under Obamacare. Let me tell you, I think the biggest divide in Washington is not a divide between Republicans and Democrats. It is a divide between entrenched politicians in both parties and the American people. And there's no better example of that than the president's decision to exempt members of Congress from Obamacare. You know, Obamacare is the single biggest job killer in this country. A couple of days ago, I was down in Kerrville, a small town in Texas in the Hill Country. Sat down with about 20 small business owners and just asked them, I said, go around the table and share with me an issue that is weighing on your heart. Totally open-ended question. Over half of the small business owners said the single biggest obstacle my business faces is Obamacare. Several of them said, listen, we've got 30, 40 employees in our business. We've got great opportunities to expand. But we're not doing them because if we get over 50 employees, we're subject to Obamacare, and that'll drive us out of business. One woman owns several fast food restaurants. She said, almost with tears in her eyes, that she has been forced to reduce the hours of every single employee on her staff to 29 hours a week or less. She said, listen, many of these employees have worked for us 10, 20 years. They can't feed their families on 29 hours a week, but if we go out of business, they can't feed their families either. Had another fellow who has a manufacturing company, builds hunting blinds. He described how, much to his chagrin, he was forced to move that manufacturing overseas to China. And he said, listen, that's 150 to 200 good jobs, manufacturing jobs, that I want to have here in the United States. But if I have it here, it's subject to Obamacare. And we can't be competitive in the marketplace with that cost, and so I'm forced to send it overseas. Just this week, UPS sent a letter to 18,000 employees saying they were dropping spousal coverage, telling those employees, your husbands and wives all just lost their health insurance. Now, we all remember President Obama telling the American people, if you like your health insurance, you can keep it. Every day that's becoming less and less true. So how do we win this fight? Listen, a lot of people will tell you this fight is not winnable. A lot of people will tell you, let me tell you what I think should happen. The House of Representatives should pass a continuing resolution that funds the entirety of the federal government, every bit of it, except Obamacare. And they should explicitly prohibit spending any money, mandatory or discretionary, on funding Obamacare. Now, the next step, we know what's happened. We've seen this play before. President Obama, Harry Reid, will scream and yell. Those mean, nasty Republicans are threatening to shut down the government. And then we ought to do something Republicans haven't done in a long time. Stand up and win the argument. We need to say, listen, we have voted to fund the government. We don't want to shut the government down. President Obama has granted waivers to giant corporations. Why is President Obama threatening to shut the government down to deny those same waivers to hardworking American families? That's an argument we can win. And if President Obama forces a partial temporary shutdown and you have an impasse, you got two sides. That impasse ends when one side or the other blinks. Now, why is it that the media always says that President Obama will never, ever, ever abandon his principles, so Republicans have to abandon ours? You want to know how we win? Don't blink. Now, at this point, I'm going to be brutally honest. We cannot win this fight if the ordinary rules of Washington apply. If the forums in which I need to make this argument are the smoke-filled rooms of Washington, D.C., we can't win this argument. Cannot be done. Someone okay over there? Okay. Let's just hold off a minute and make sure she's all right.
She's okay, sir.
Okay.
We have it's under control right now.
Okay. The ordinary rules of Washington won't win this fight. I can't win this fight. Mike Lee can't win this fight. There is no elected politician in Washington who can win this fight. Only you can win this fight. The only way this fight can be won is if I'm right that we're seeing a new paradigm, a new model, the rise of the grassroots. You know, it's interesting. Reporters have been asking, well, how's it going convincing your colleagues in Washington? Listen, the plan to defund Obamacare has been called deceptive, deceitful, nuts, crazy, stupid, and wacko. And that's just by Republicans. But the answer I give to our friends in the Fourth Estate is, listen, I'm not trying to convince my colleagues. I'm trying to make the case to the American people. A national website has been launched, don'tfundit.com, don'tfundit.com. If you haven't done so already, I would urge each and every one of you to go to don'tfundit.com, sign the national petition, call your elected representatives, and get 10, 20, 30, 50 of your friends to do the same.
Can we make it Banner's homepage?
Do you know in just a few weeks, we have gotten over 500,000 signatures on don'tfundit.com? In just a few weeks. The only way we will win this fight is if we see a grassroots tsunami. If between now and September 30th we see millions upon millions upon millions of Americans going to don'tfundit.com, signing the petition, speaking out, and holding our elected officials accountable. There's nothing that gets an elected official's attention more than hearing from his or her constituents. And let me tell you, liberty is never safer than when politicians are terrified. So the most important reason I am here today is to ask for your help. If you agree we should save the American people from this train wreck, we should bring back jobs, bring back growth, then I need your help. We need your help in the next 38 days to get as many people as possible to come together and hold our elected officials accountable. Every one of us, including me. And let me tell you the most important reason economic growth is important. Because it's foundational to opportunity. It is foundational to helping people achieve the American dream. For a long, long time, I've advocated what I call opportunity conservatism, which is that every policy as conservatives we think about, we talk about, should focus like a laser on opportunity, on how it impacts the least off among us, how it impacts young people and Hispanics and African Americans and single moms, those struggling to climb the economic ladder. Look, the dirty little secret that very few in the media will tell you, it's the people who have been hurt the most by the Obama economy are the least off among us. Under President Obama, Hispanic unemployment climbed to nearly 10%. African American unemployment to 14%. Youth unemployment, age 16 to 19, over 25%. Listen, when you pound small businesses with $1.3 trillion in new taxes, with massive regulations, it's not the CEOs who get hurt. If you were flying in a private jet 5 years ago, you're still flying in a private jet. The people who are getting hurt are those struggling to climb the economic ladder. The ones who are finding their hours forcibly reduced to 29 hours a week are the single moms trying to put food on the table for their kids. In the last election, Jay Leno, right before the election, said, "So the Obama campaign is targeting first-time voters." Well, of course he is. The second-time voters have all graduated. They can't find a job. We should be the party of the 47%. We should be the party of those climbing the economic ladder, because you know what? The American free enterprise system has been the greatest engine of prosperity and opportunity the world has ever seen. No nation on earth has allowed so many millions to come from all over the world with nothing and achieve anything. I want to close with two final observations. One, in my life, as in all of your lives, freedom, opportunity, they're not abstract concepts. They're not things we read about in a book. They're real and personal, and they're part of who we are. In my family, my dad is from Cuba. He grew up in Cuba, and as a kid, when he was 14, he began fighting in the Cuban Revolution. He was thrown in prison and tortured by the Batista regime, beaten almost to death. Today, my father's a pastor in Dallas. To this day, his front teeth are not his own because they were kicked out of his mouth when he was a teenager. My dad fled Cuba in 1957, and he came to Texas. When he landed in Austin, he was 18 years old. He couldn't speak a word of English. He had nothing but $100 sewn into his underwear. I don't actually advise carrying money in your underwear. And he got a job washing dishes. He made 50 cents an hour. And he worked 7 days a week. He paid his way through the University of Texas. He went on to get a job. He started a small business, and he worked towards the American dream. When I was a kid, my dad used to say to me over and over again, when we faced depression in Cuba, I had a place to flee to. If we lose our freedom here, where do we go? Now, my entire life, my dad has been my hero. But you know what I find most incredible about his story? How commonplace it is. Every one of us here has a story just like that. Whether it's us or our parents or our great-great-great-grandparents, we are all the children of those who risked everything for freedom. Each one of us could walk up here one at a time and tell those stories. And I'm going to suggest to you that's the most fundamental DNA of what it means to be an American, to value freedom and opportunity above all else. And that's why we're going to succeed in turning this around. The final thing I want to say. If you remember nothing that I said tonight, then you probably had too much to drink. If you remember one thing that I said tonight, let it be this. That as dire as things look right now, I am profoundly optimistic. We've seen things look dire before. I'm optimistic for three simple reasons. Number one, we're right. Freedom works. There is a very simple dynamic. Conservatives win when we effectively articulate what it is we believe. Because this is fundamentally a center-right nation. And liberals win when they effectively obfuscate what they believe. Their policies do not work, and all we have to do is speak the truth. Secondly, there is a new generation of leaders stepping forward in Washington. You know, if you look at new young leaders, people like Rand Paul and Marco Rubio and Mike Lee and Kelly Ayotte, you know what is incredible? 5 years ago, not a one of them was in office. You have to go back to after World War II to see an instance where the generation of leaders who were effectively defending free market principles is a new generation stepping forward. And let me suggest something. If you look at that new generation, they're almost exactly the same age. You know, in my instance, I was 10 when Ronald Reagan became president. I was 18 when Ronald Reagan left the White House. Now, you know how for the World War II generation, many of them would refer to FDR as our president? I can tell you this, I will go to my grave with Ronald Wilson Reagan defining what it means to be president. He didn't blink. But I have referred to this next generation, this new generation, as the children of Reagan. Because listen to them communicate. Listen to Kelly stand up and talk about free market principles. Listen to Marco. Listen to Rand. They're positive, hopeful, optimistic, unifying, appealing to our better angels. They're echoes of Ronald Reagan. They're not mean, nasty, hateful, divisive, using wedge issues. They're saying we as Americans can get back to our founding principles that have made this nation so great. And the third and final reason I am optimistic, the biggest reason, is because of each of you. Because of the rise of the grassroots. If we're right that the American people are standing up and saying enough already, we're going to take our country back, we're going to get back to free market principles, we're going to get back to the Constitution, we're going to get back to the founding principles that made this the freest and greatest country on earth. You know, it took Jimmy Carter to give us Ronald Reagan. And I am convinced that the most longest lasting legacy of President Obama is going to be all of us standing up together, arm in arm, to restore that shining city on a hill that is the United States of America. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you so much. First of all, I want to say I learned something new tonight. Here in New Hampshire, we say thank you all. Apparently in Texas, they thank all you all. So is that more thank you or more people? I'm not sure what that is.
So technically speaking, all y'all is the plural of y'all.
Okay, there you go. I want to just very quickly, you just reminded me, I'm going to say this very quickly. It was Ronald Reagan who reminded us that freedom is always only one generation away from extinction. And if we do not engage now in the fight to preserve freedom, then we will one day be telling our children and our children's children what it once was like to be free. That's why we're all here. Thank you so much.